Apologies, my mic was muted. Welcome to our program this evening, Accounting for Climate, Safeguarding Climate Concerns in the Federal Budget. We're so excited this evening to share with you our lineup of expert speakers from across EDF. My name's Alex Ross, and I work on the grassroots engagement team here at EDF Action. As the advocacy partner of the Environmental Defense Fund, we are really making sure to hold agencies close during this time. And we want to share also how you can make your voice heard in this whole federal budget process. So before we begin, I just wanted to go over a couple ground rules for folks who are tuning into the call. So we are live. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. We'll be able to see them, and we'll try to get to as many as we can throughout tonight's program. A recording of tonight's program will also be available to everyone who RSVP'd, as well as available on our Facebook and YouTube right afterwards. So feel free to rewatch if you can. And so to begin tonight's program, we are going to be welcoming Sophie Osborne, Federal Affairs Manager at EDF, to talk a little bit more about what is the federal budget process. So Sophie, over to you.
Thanks, Alex, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm trying to do a very high-level overview of what can be a very complicated process, but really important for folks to understand as we head into the fall, as we look towards congressional action. So next slide, please. So a little bit of a refresher from your civics lessons in school, but as a reminder and sort of setting the stage for this whole process, the U.S. Constitution lays out sort of the ground rules for all of this. Within the Constitution, there's the separation of powers, and specifically the power to spend and delegate how money is spent is given to the legislative branch, not the other two branches, but this is solely Congress's purview. Next slide, please. So this is coming up a lot recently because, unfortunately, President Trump and his administration have slightly different interpretations of this, but it's laid out in the Constitution. Article 1 gives the power of spending money and deciding how money is spent to the U.S. Congress. So this is that slide right there. Thank you. Now, what does that actually look like in practice? It's a bit of a complicated process, but it can kind of be broken down at a high level into just 3 steps. So the first step is federal agencies draft up their budget request for the upcoming fiscal year, a lot like private companies or organizations. They set what they want to be spending their money on and what they think would be impactful for their missions as set out by law. Then they send these requests and outlines to the White House. The White House will then compile that and align it with their coming priorities, mostly political priorities, to see how it fits into their agenda for the coming fiscal year. Importantly, the budget that the White House and the federal agencies compile is a request to the U.S. Congress. Ultimately, the Congress has the power to enact that, so they can take the request into consideration. It might hold a lot of sway with certain members of Congress if they're aligned with the administration's agenda or opposed to it, but it is just a request. It is more, these days, kind of a messaging document to outline the political administration's priorities for how to spend taxpayer dollars. So that budget request then goes to Congress, and then Congress takes a part in a couple months process to draft spending bills. They take those requests into consideration and then draft bills that they pass through both chambers and then are finally signed into law by the president. And those are legally binding directives for how to spend money. There's a bit of confusion in the courts right now as the Trump administration tries to illegally withhold some of this congressionally directed funding. So there's a lot of tension in the process right now, but ultimately Congress holds power over how money is spent. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, along with a lot of the other egregious attacks on climate and environment that we've seen from the Trump administration this past 8 months, it's gone by so fast, They've also been proposing to slash a lot of federal funding for very critical agencies. So, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, Administrator Lee Zeldin and President Trump, they are proposing to slash the budget by 55%, which is just completely unworkable for what is actually quite a small agency in terms of its budget, but has a huge impact on climate protections, on clean air protections, clean water protections, making sure toxic chemicals are removed from toxic cleanup sites, and making sure that the communities we live in are safe and healthy and that we're building towards a brighter future for everyone. So this is a really unfortunate proposal from the administration. Next slide, please. Another example of how they're proposing to attack climate is in their budget for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. You might have seen NOAA in the news because they fund a lot of climate research focused on our atmosphere, our air, our oceans. NOAA also houses within it the National Weather Service. So this is how you get weather predictions on your iPhone, your Android, or on the news. All of that data and science is compiled by astronomers and scientists over at NOAA. But unfortunately, the sort of climate and weather science headings have caught the administration's attention, and they're proposing really egregious cuts to these critical programs. Next slide, please. So, circling back to what I said earlier, this ultimately is decided by Congress. The president and his administrators can propose what they think should happen, but ultimately it is our elected representatives who have the power to decide whether this is what happens or not. So these are pictures of a couple of our top leader appropriators from across the aisles and in both chambers who are at this moment crafting these bills and negotiating with both parties to try to find a path forward and pass final legislation on this. Next slide, please. So we can see some of this pushback happening already, but of course they're going to need a lot of support in the coming months to maintain this momentum and not succumb to what the president has been really forcefully requesting. So this chart outlines where the different proposals are. I won't get too much into detail, but I will particularly note the darker green bar, which shows what the Senate has been proposing for funding the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency. So you can see that those green bars are much closer to what the levels enacted are currently. So these wouldn't be these drastic, horrible cuts that the president is proposing, but rather protecting, maintaining, and recognizing the need to continue to fund these important programs. Next slide. And I mentioned earlier the Senate. The Senate is particularly important in this process because with the current political makeup, we need at least 7 Democrats to vote for any measure that has to do with funding bills. So this wouldn't be a simple majority 51 vote threshold. It would be a 60 vote threshold. So this is where Democrats can hold some power in the process, unlike some previous votes we've seen in the past couple of months. So in order to get those 7 Democrats on board, Republicans are going to have to negotiate and give some room towards their priorities. And so we need to be making sure that all of our members of Congress understand that these are not agencies or programs that can be cut willy-nilly, that they are critical and vital for our communities and our climate going forward. Next slide, please. So there's probably going to be a lot of news about this coming out of Washington in the coming months. So the fiscal year ends on September 30th, and that's when funding for the current fiscal year runs out. We'll see a lot of sort of brinksmanship and political grandstanding leading up to this moment, with either party in Congress not wanting to give in to find a deal to continue to fund the government. It's pretty contentious right now, and so I wouldn't be super surprised if we saw at least a partial or a mini government shutdown, and then that could force negotiators back to the table to try to work out a deal to sort of extend funding a little bit and try to find a final negotiated deal. So while we'll see this flare up towards the end of September, the real action we expect to continue later into the fall and into the winter when lawmakers are discussing in the halls of Congress how to fund the government for the continuing year. So this extended period, there will be multiple moments where we can make our voices heard and ensure that Congress knows where we stand on these issues. Next slide, please. So we'll probably reiterate this at the very end, but just wanted to emphasize here that we urge you, if you are interested in engaging and making your voice heard in this process, that this is the moment to be telling our members of Congress to reject the cuts that the president is suggesting and to make sure that we're robustly funding all of these agencies and programs that are continuing the vital science and environmental protections that our communities rely on. With that, I'll pass it back to Alex, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Sophie. That was a really in-depth presentation, and I feel like really emphasized for me that right now is such a critical time for us to be reaching out to our representatives, to our senators, to really make a difference in this process. So the next part of our program, Sophie, I'll have you stay on just till the end in case we have any questions that come up. But for the next part of our program, I'm going to be introducing our panel for this evening. I'm so excited to introduce you to these wonderful folks. They are some of the greatest colleagues, and I'm so excited to be welcoming them this evening. So first up, we have Amy Folkerts, Senior Analyst on our Federal Affairs team. Grace T. Lewis, Senior Health Scientist on our Healthy Communities team. And then Olivia Stevens, a Project Manager on our Campaigns and Partnerships team. So that's a whole lot of words about a whole lot of stuff. Would you each mind sort of telling me a little bit about what it is that you do at EDF and how that plays into our conversation this evening? We'll start with Amy.
Yeah, hi everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Amy. I am a colleague with Sophie on our Federal Affairs team. So I am essentially one of our lobbyists advocating for sustainable fisheries, oceans, and coastal resilience policy. So what this looks like on a day-to-day basis is it's a lot of getting our experts at EDF and our policies and priorities that we care about and hopefully that you care about in front of members of Congress and their staff. Really educating them on why these programs are so important and what they need to do to advance good policy that for me is like advancing sustainable fisheries, making our oceans more resilient to climate change. And so we're working hand in hand with legislators and their staff on kind of figuring out what legislation should look like, sending out vote recommendations, sending out EDF's resources and science as we do it. I don't know, I think that's good, Alex. I'll pass it back to you.
I think that's me. You're on mute, Alex. Hi, everybody. I'm Grace T. Lewis. I'm a senior health scientist at EDF. I'm an epidemiologist by training, and a lot of the day-to-day work that I do involves working with our community-based organization partners and trying to help them to implement and realize their community priorities and solutions to different, providing them with technical support and guidance on a variety of different health-related and environmental justice and climate-related projects. I also work on air monitoring, both community air monitoring and regional air monitoring. So I sit on different committees to try to improve air quality in our in the Houston metropolitan region in general, in Texas. and also work on resilience projects, in particular with a range of different community organizations and partners, community health centers in Texas and Louisiana, which are among our most climate vulnerable nationally. I love to work with communities. We have academic partners and government partners, and just trying to educate and empower them in the work that we do.
Awesome, thank you. Apologies, I keep hitting that mute button. Olivia, over to you.
Hey everyone, my name is excuse me, Olivia Stevens. I am a project manager on our campaigns and partnerships team at EDF and EDF Action. And my role involves helping to manage our federal legislation. So what that looks like, looks like I cut out for a second, is helping work across teams, across EDF, to build out what our campaign goals look like, and then building out tactics and strategies in order to get us closer to those goals. So it's really kind of cross-organization, working with a lot of different teams, folks on our federal affairs team and also our programs teams. And one of the campaigns that I am leading is our appropriations campaign. So the topic that we're discussing today. So excited to be here and excited to dive into the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining us and lending us your expertise and time. We really appreciate it. So our first question this evening, we just got a wonderful overview of some of these agencies that are really important, specifically the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and the Federal Emergency Management Administration or Agency. So EPA, NOAA, FEMA. Why is it important to keep those agencies funded? I know that's kind of a broad question, but who would like to take the first try at it?
I can jump in on EPA. So, we all know clean water and breathable air are our most basic needs for survival, and we shouldn't have to think about the effects of those basic needs on our health and safety. The Environmental Protection Agency was developed to protect human health and the environment, to prevent rampant pollution that causes asthma and heart disease, and to protect our drinking water from contamination. So EPA air programs monitor pollution and limit emissions from vehicles and industry. They protect people from asthma and heart disease and other health risks. The agency's water programs safeguard our drinking water, support water infrastructure, and monitor and respond to contaminated water sources. And EPA ensures that polluters are held accountable and that environmental protections are real and that they're enforced and not just words on paper. The agency conducts scientific research on climate change, and toxins, and health impacts to inform policy and public protections. And it oversees cleanup of contaminated sites and ensures safe disposal of hazardous waste, things like that. So it really does so much that kind of goes unseen by us, luckily, because we don't usually have to worry about those things. And so that's why it's really important that we maintain funding for the agency.
Thank you for that, Olivia. So many things that the EPA does and is responsible for, I'm always sort of blown away. Amy, could you tell us a little bit more about NOAA and FEMA? I feel like that's your area of expertise.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Sophie touched on it a bit briefly already, but NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And both of these agencies work really closely together on kind of both sides of the climate resilience and preparedness coin. So NOAA is mostly focused on pre-disaster science, forecasting, disaster tracking, while FEMA primarily focuses on disaster response. So just to give you a bit of an overview as to what both of these agencies do and why they're so critical, I'll tell you all about them because NOAA also is another one where there's just so many different functions within the one agency. So NOAA is charged with forecasting weather, monitoring oceanic and atmospheric conditions, doing deep sea mapping, exploration, and also managing our fishing resources and protecting marine mammals and endangered species in the US waters. So if NOAA is dismantled or if its staff is cut further than the cuts that we've already seen earlier this year, we really risk the US falling behind in our understanding of our oceans, our atmosphere, the impacts of climate change. Industries like agriculture and fisheries could lose access to the data that they depend on to keep them safe and to keep us fed. And communities are also more at risk to increasing disasters and severe weather without timely and accurate warnings and modeling, like we're seeing right now with this rapidly intensifying hurricane off the East Coast. In terms of FEMA, so FEMA is the lead agency for coordinating disaster response, recovery, and preparedness. It also plays an essential role in building resilience to disasters before they happen through mapping, risk assessments, grant programs, technical support for local agencies, which is really important. So we're not just always spending to rebuild, we're getting ahead of what these impacts might be. So FEMA plays a really, really crucial role. And both of these agencies have unfortunately already seen extensive cuts under the Trump administration and their efforts to reduce the size of the federal government. So we just really believe that investment is more necessary than ever with the impacts of climate change, as we're seeing more frequent and more intense disasters. And also, to make sure that communities and the economies that rely on the resources and the services that these agencies provide are able to stay safe and thrive.
Thank you, Amy. I feel like that's such an important point, that this money that's being cut or the proposed cuts would come directly from communities and really helping them prepare for these disasters that we know are going to get worse over time. And then we're not going to be able to track them as easily as well. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, I feel like, and is really, really irresponsible for our nation. Grace, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about sort of the health side impacts that we would see from these proposed cuts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that obviously, like the EPA and FEMA and NOAA, they play a really important role for keeping communities strong, in that we all rely on their data, and so loss of that access to that data is vitally important. In addition to these federal agencies, the assault on science and weakening of our public health system, because I think coordinated, these all work together. And I think that the public health system in particular is under serious threat right now. We see changes to scientific advisory boards, research funding at both the National Institute of Health and the Centers for Disease Control, who are really advancing science and the understanding of diseases and exposures. So this is like really a concerted effort, because organizations like EPA rely on the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control to work together to understand, like, where are the boundaries of health, and how do we set those protective health-based standards, for instance, in the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. So we need that hand-in-hand work together of these federal agencies and strengthening of those public health systems, as we saw during the pandemic, as we're seeing, continuing to see as more and more pollution affects people's health, and how when you have those overburdened communities that have pre-existing health conditions because of environmental, overburdened environmental conditions producing those health conditions, we need the strengthening of those combined efforts of public health with EPA and organizations like NOAA and FEMA, because a lot of times those same systems are vulnerable to those natural disasters from extreme weather events. And how do communities rebound from that? And how does the public health infrastructure then able to respond to not only environmental threats, but those climate threats and how they're impacting communities? So We also see a loss of funding to organizations like the World Health Organization. That's critical for those global surveillance systems and being able to measure emerging and existing threats and how they could pose a risk to us in terms of our health in the United States. So we've already seen the resurgence of measles and other preventable diseases and diseases that cross our borders. And so we really need to have dedicated public health infrastructure for our continued population health. And the U.S. has always been a leader and at the epicenter of both scientific and health research. And so federal funding is really needed to keep us at the top and for us to keep innovating.
Thank you, Grace. I feel like that's such an important point about the way that agencies work together to support each other. That really drives home why we need to fund not just one of them, but all of the agencies. So thank you. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about different tools that are available not only to scientists and folks here at EDF, but also to our advocates across the country. And Grace, I know this is your specialty, but could you tell us a little bit more about the Climate Vulnerability Index? And specifically, how would that really help us in this sort of fight for federal funding?
Yes, absolutely. One of my passions, data. And so the Climate Vulnerability Index is a screening and mapping tool that makes publicly available data from a broad range of sources accessible to help us understand how communities are climate vulnerable and what is really driving that vulnerability cumulatively and where resources really need to be directed to make the greatest impact. So the CVI shows us there is no state in the 50 states and District of Columbia that is not climate vulnerable in some way, shape, or form. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take a few minutes to illustrate the CVI and how that works. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen really quickly.
Yes, please.
Oh, okay, I say that. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to share my screen.
No worries. There we go.
Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Did you want to put it into presentation mode?
Yes. Hold on. Let me figure out how to do that. Okay. I think I'll just go ahead and move in the interest of time. So I think my presentation is really centered around the fact that we know that communities of color and low wealth often bear a disproportionate burden of environmental and climate threats. And they have, as a result, led to an unequal distribution of health burdens. And this is a result of different policies and different program differences that have resulted in the disproportionate placement of hazardous waste sites and other environmental sources of pollution into communities of color and low wealth. And that we really need a data-driven way to be able to understand who is at greatest risk and why. And unfortunately, a lot of these tools that the federal government has created have become dismantled or restricted. And we see here just a small swath of some of these tools that we have come to rely on to help us to gather that information to understand these sources of vulnerability. So we created this tool, the U.S. Climate Vulnerability, and this is our website, and you'll see here on the top part of the screen the actual URL to get it. So this is the Climate Vulnerability Index, and I'll leave it to you to be able to take a look at all of these different tabs later on. But the CVI is a way for us to understand in partnership and created in partnership with community-based organizations, who is most vulnerable, climate vulnerable in the United States. We wanted to understand the intersection between climate, environment, and health, and to broadly define where the most vulnerable communities are and what are the factors that are underlying that vulnerability, so that we could try to empower communities with that scientific data that allows them to be able to communicate with academics and decision makers, and to try to direct the resources to make the most impact to communities in order to develop policies and to develop programs to address both climate, environmental, and health disparities. And so what we did was we took a tool. We looked at more than 200 different data sets, and we wound up integrating 184 different indicators to allow us to rank more than 70,000 census tracts. And a census tract is a roughly, if you remember from taking the census, which allows us to measure the number of people and where they're distributed, but also gives us like our congressional districts and stuff like that. It's about 2,000 to 4,000 people within a census tract. So we tried to look at the neighborhood level of these 184 different indicators to give us a holistic approach to understanding those different sources of vulnerability. And so we create a unitless index score that allows us to not only rank and compare them, but also to visualize them. So this is the kind of methodology, and you can see it more acutely in our paper. But basically, we are looking at community baseline data. So those are the factors that make a community both resilient as well as vulnerable. And so these are our four main themes of which we aggregate our 184 indicators. And this is historical data that we've used and aggregated into these four different categories. And we also have climate change impacts. And this is data that is both the social and economic and extreme weather events that have an impact on communities, both in the past and in the future. So what we see, if we are able to visualize this unitless index score, which is what we've done here, the highest ranking communities are the darkest color. And that we notice that across the United States, there is no community, again, the 50 states or District of Columbia, that is not climate vulnerable in some way, shape, or form. But we do see that in the South and Southeast is the largest concentration of those most climate vulnerable communities. And so you can take a look here, and I'll show you an example in a few minutes of how you can avail yourself of that information. And you can compare both at the neighborhood level, you can compare counties, and you can compare states, and by EPA region. So there are training modules, there's short videos that you can watch, as well as a downloadable set of a webinar kit, which will give you templates that you can use to create letters or to show you how to put that information from the CVI into action. And here is just a quick example of the Pleasantville community in Houston. It happens to rank number 26 out of 73,000 plus census tracts in the United States or neighborhoods. And so you could take this information of all those community baseline or the climate change impacts, and you can see how they rank both in your state and nationally. So this gives us a ranking in comparison to every single neighborhood across the United States. And when you go into that, it gives you what are those top drivers. So the under community baseline, we see the transportation sources, pollution sources, and chronic diseases. They rank in the top 1% nationally. And what's driving their vulnerability is coming from flooding, economic and productivity losses. And you can see that this is the top 1% up to the top 10. And then you can dig in deeper
Grace,
for all of these.
sorry to interrupt you. If you don't mind, I think we're only seeing the first slide. So if you just click on the slide that you're on, I think we'll be able to see it a little bit better.
Okay. Oh, can you see that? No.
I think we lost your screen. Also, hello to my cat, who always joins our calls.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries. I just wanted to make sure because you were saying so many good things.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about
connections were being made.
that. I'm hoping that it's popping up.
Yes.
Okay, can you see this? Are you seeing just this one slide?
Yes, the Pleasantville. Yep.
Okay, so this slide, and I apologize that I didn't realize I was not, you were not seeing my slides move. But just going back to this is like showing you some of the top drivers, and then you can dig in on the right-hand side. You can see how you can dig into, like if you, for instance, chose community baseline under each of the 4 different categories, what are the top drivers and what are the percentile rankings for each of these? So did that change screen? Hopefully you see top drivers of community baseline vulnerability now. Are you able to?
Sorry. Yes,
Oh,
we see it.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So, and this is kind of showing you how you can break down and see. So for each of these, it will give you both the percentile rank as well as being able to show you the visualization of this. So for all 184 indicators, or by showing you this here, you can see on the side, you can click on any one of these themes or different categories and each of the individual indicators that will allow you to be able to visualize that. So for instance, I can show you like what are some of the top drivers, and this box is really just summarizing that. And so you can look at the percentile ranking for each of these different categories, like main domains, and each of the different subcategories, they have them ranked as well. And you can pull out like why are you ranking so high, or what's driving those community rankings. And so you can see here for baseline health that Pleasantville has a lot of chronic diseases, both respiratory, cardiovascular, diabetes. They have poor screening, low life expectancy, access to care, and maternal and child health. So there, you're able to look at the intersection of environment, infrastructure, health, social, economic, as well as those climate change impacts. So it really allows you to dig into, if you wanted to look at it just by theme, or if you wanted to dig in by a particular category or a different or a particular indicator. So you really get a holistic approach of how a community is being disadvantaged and where could you make the biggest impact by directing either funding or resources or programs to that particular area.
Awesome. Thank you, Grace. That was really wonderful.
And I would definitely encourage you to look at the different 3 to 5 minute tutorials and download the webinar kit, because it gives you templates that you can just take the screenshots or download the reports and being able to put them into those different templates. And you can use it to either create strategic plans or engage your elected officials as to why these are really important to your community.
Absolutely. I was going to say, in this fight for federal funding, I think this is a perfect tool to really demonstrate for our representatives just how critical this money is and these programs are for our communities. So thank you so much. I want to dive back into our panel. So I'm going to bring our other panelists back on really quick just to talk a little bit more about some of these proposed cuts. And specifically, I'm really curious from y'all, what we would expect to see sort of especially in more rural or local communities, if this funding was, or if these proposed cuts went through. Olivia, could you get us started?
Sure, yeah. So as Sophie mentioned in her presentation, the president's budget proposes to cut the EPA by more than half. So this would include staffing cuts, cuts to environmental justice programs, cuts to state grants for air quality and drinking water, cuts to compliance and enforcement to ensure that polluters are held accountable, and cuts to scientific research. So these cuts would have real consequences for communities all over the country. It would mean less accountability for corporate polluters, allowing more climate and toxic pollution to seep into our air and our water. Families would face greater risks of lead poisoning and exposure to harmful chemicals in their homes and their food. When air programs are cut, smog and soot increase, worsening asthma and respiratory illnesses, especially among children and seniors and people with pre-existing conditions. Cuts to water programs put public health at risk and shift the burden of costly cleanups to local communities that are often least able to afford them. And when enforcement is weakened, like I said, polluters are let off the hook. And that really leaves, again, the burden on families and taxpayers to bear those consequences. So EPA cuts could really truly endanger people's health and safety and economic security in every corner of the country. And that's why it's so imperative that we maintain funding for the agency and for the programs that it provides.
Yeah. Amy.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I know I saw a comment in one of the chats asking about how, to get through to Republican legislators about the impacts of these cuts. And I think that's one of the things that we're really focusing on, is that these agencies have a footprint in every US state, and folks really rely on them for all of the services that they provide. And so one of the things that we're focusing on is educating those members of Congress on the direct local impacts that these agencies have in their states and their districts, and what they really stand to lose if they go through with carrying out Trump's proposed cuts. And so that's just kind of a general framing as I get into some of these things, because it definitely sounds a bit gloom and doom, but you all should know that we're really working to advocate with members of Congress across the aisle to think about how this really trickles down in the neck of their woods. So talking about NOAA, I know you all probably heard about this, but NOAA houses the National Weather Service. So if we're looking at decreasing NOAA's funding or cutting even more staff, you're going to endanger the public having access to weather forecasts, emergency alerts, especially for disasters like hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and the Republican Blueprint Project 2025 even proposed privatizing the Weather Service, which means that folks, particularly in rural areas, may lose access to free and reliable forecasts if these proposals do go through. The other thing I really want to highlight is the attack on climate science. So the Trump administration is really attempting to dismantle NOAA's leadership in climate research and education on the climate crisis. But as many of you know, eliminating the climate science is not going to mean that the problem goes away. It just means that the United States will be less prepared and informed as we see more and more daily impacts from climate change and disasters. And kind of going off of what I was talking about earlier, we're also putting at risk resilience and pre-disaster mitigation efforts to improve infrastructure that helps communities adapt to rising sea levels, storms, flooding, and cutting these investments pre-disaster will increase the long-term costs of rebuilding, and as well as putting communities at risk. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight for NOAA that we are really tracking in states and districts is threats to sustainable seafood. NOAA manages our nation's saltwater fisheries, but the lack of staffing and funding threatens the long-term sustainability of that resource, particularly as it adapts to climate change and warming oceans. And I guess I'll just turn to FEMA, and I will say that FEMA has also been targeted by the Trump administration for a complete overhaul. The administration really wants to drastically shrink FEMA's footprint in the states and shift more responsibility for disaster preparedness and response back onto the states. And so, I think that really shows that not all states, governments, localities are equipped to handle these disasters, particularly when they're at the scale that we are seeing nowadays. And that's really where FEMA is able to step in and fill that gap. One particular example is the canceling recently of our nation's largest disaster preparedness and climate mitigation or climate adaptation grant program. This program helped fund community-driven projects that would increase resilience to natural disasters. And its cancellation means that those projects have just been stopped completely where they're at, and communities are now left to figure out how to fund finishing those. So many communities are not able to finish those projects that they were promised funding for. So I'll just reiterate what we were saying, which is the good news is that these proposed cuts are proposed. And so there is still a chance for Congress to be pushing back and reasserting their power of the purse and setting more reasonable funding levels and recognizing all that these agencies do that impact folks' daily lives.
Thank you, Amy. There are so many pieces of NOAA that I didn't even know affected us. So that was very insightful. Grace, I was wondering if you could chat a little bit about, especially for the communities that you work with, what some of these proposed cuts, how that would really manifest.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that as I was mentioning, and of course my real interest is on the health side, so these cuts are potentially threatening those public health agencies and programs that support chronic diseases like asthma and lead programs to get lead out of our kids' houses, as well as to be able to test kids for lead, to address lead in drinking water and other stuff like that. So surveillance programs and climate-related health programs, like those that are addressing heat in particular, which is increasingly with our warming planet becoming more of a problem. But it also threatens the infrastructure investments in communities, whether that's air monitoring or it is education or housing, vaccinations, green spaces and parks that are an integral part of community well-being. And so this is coupled with, again, the removing of data and censoring those data sources, as well as altering the Clean Air Act and exemptions for the polluters that have the potential to contaminate the air and cause health risks to those most vulnerable communities. And we see that these are all interrelated because these are parts of those social determinants of health or those non-medical drivers that are really impacting population health and well-being. But they're also impacting federally qualified health centers. And so these programs in particular, these health centers are losing, they're intended to help those living with disability or chronic diseases, pregnant women, infant and children who need nutritional assistance or routine care for the poor is becoming less accessible because these health centers are losing their federal funding because of the proposed cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. And so low-income communities in particular are going to feel that great impact. And as the CVI, the Climate Vulnerability Index, shows us, they already lack these health resources. And this makes accessing care much more difficult to them. And so it's jeopardizing that health infrastructure and, again, weakening that public health system. But it's also impacting those federally funded grants. As Amy was just mentioning, like those Justice 40 grants, like the Community Change grants or the solar and renewable energy projects that were funded to try to address these existing root causes of disparities. But they're also they've cut funding to technical assistance centers as well as environmental infrastructure projects. And so that's really how it's affecting the communities that I'm working with.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah, those are some pretty steep impacts from just a few programs, and who knows, the wide-reaching implications of 5 to 10 years from now of not providing these resources. So I really appreciate that. We are running a little bit over on time, so I think I'm going to move us along past the next question to our advocacy ask for this evening. So we had mentioned this earlier on our introduction about the action we're going to ask folks to take this evening around the appropriations process or the federal budget process, really leaning on Congress and telling them to reject these cuts. because they are just a proposal, and we can definitely make a difference. And now is the time to do that. You know, the Congress is on break right now, but they're coming back in just a little bit. And this is going to be the first thing that they sort of take up. So your messages will be really critical right now. And then I think the link should be shared in the chat. So wherever you're watching from, you should be able to access it. Just to reiterate all the great points that our speakers shared with us this evening, that we're really seeing real threats to our water, to our air, to climate-fueled natural disasters, and communities are really struggling to respond to just the overwhelming challenges in the face of a changing climate. So we really need to double down, not cut back on these programs that keep our air and water safe and help our communities prepare for and respond to disasters. Thank you all so much. I wanted to thank again our lovely panelists this evening for joining us and taking the time to talk to us about these critical programs. Apologies again for my cat. And so, yes, I guess if there's any final sort of thoughts we can leave folks with. I know we didn't have time to really get to audience questions, but just, I guess, yeah, a few brief words to sort of wrap up the evening. I'll let each of you sort of share if you'd like.
Yeah, just thanks for having me, and make sure folks reach out to their members of Congress. It's really important, especially here in the next 5 or 6 weeks or so as we approach the September 30th deadline. So yeah, it was nice to chat with everybody, and have a great evening.
Thanks everyone for joining. I'll just say, I know that times are really tough right now and a lot of us feel overwhelmed. But something I saw recently is if we want to continue living in a democracy, we have to act like we are. So that means getting out there, protesting, calling your representatives, making a fuss, giving political cover to folks who are fighting back by showing that their constituents support them, that people are angry, and not just letting things happen in a vacuum. So I'll just encourage you to get out there and fight like our democracy depends on it, and keep advocating for these great things. And thanks so much for your support.
Yeah, thank you for having me today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to and love the great work that Olivia and Amy, Alex are doing, and I hope that if you have any questions, please reach out to me, but I hope that you'll use the Climate Vulnerability Index and all the amazing data that's contained in it to really inform yourself and your elected representatives, and to advocate for strengthening and building a stronger, more resilient communities.
Thank you so much. And thank you all again for a lovely discussion. And thank you to everyone who joined the call this evening and took action to make a better future for us all. Thank you and good night.